The morning Sarah Chen discovered the excavators tearing up her grandmother's garden, she thought it was just another case of contractor confusion. By sunset, she'd learned that 20 tons of concrete and chlorinated water had become the centerpiece of a murder investigation, and the wealthy family next door would do anything to keep their dark secret buried beneath the perfectly tiled bottom of their brand new infinity pool. Sarah Chen's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her Toyota Camry lurching to a stop in front of the Victorian house that had been her sanctuary for 23 years. The rumble of heavy machinery filled the morning air, drowning out the usual chorus of songbirds that nested in her grandmother's century-old oak trees. "What the hell?" she whispered, staring at the massive excavator parked squarely in the middle of her backyard, its steel jaw dripping with dark earth that had once been her grandmother's prized rose garden. A man in a hard hat and reflective vest approached her car, clipboard in hand. His weathered face bore the no-nonsense expression of someone accustomed to dealing with neighborhood complaints. "You're gonna need to move your vehicle. We've got concrete trucks coming through in about an hour." Sarah's door slammed shut with more force than she'd intended. "Move my vehicle. This is my house. That's my yard you're tearing apart." The foreman's eyes narrowed as he consulted his clipboard. "According to our permits, this is 1247 Maple Grove Drive. We are contracted to install an infinity pool for the Blackwood family." "The Blackwoods live at 1249, Sarah said, her voice rising. "Next door. That's their house." She pointed to the imposing colonial mansion that loomed over her modest Victorian like a disapproving parent. The foreman squinted at his paperwork, then at the brass numbers on Sarah's front door. His face went pale. "Ah, shit. Hold on." He pulled out his phone and walked several feet away, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Sarah watched him with growing dread. The excavator had already carved a hole the size of a small house into her backyard. Decades of carefully tended flower beds lay in ruins, reduced to muddy tracks and scattered petals. Her grandmother's memory garden, the place where she'd spread Nai's ashes just 2 years ago, was now nothing but churned earth and diesel fumes. Sarah, what's going on?" She turned to find Marcus Delacroix jogging across the street, still in his hospital scrubs from his night shift at Presbyterian. His dark eyes widened as he took in the destruction. "They are building a pool," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "On my land. The Blackwoods hired them to build a pool on my land." Marcus's jaw tightened. As her neighbor and closest friend since childhood, he'd witnessed firsthand the careful love she'd poured into this property since inheriting it from her grandmother. "That's not legal. They can't just The foreman returned, his complexion now resembling wet concrete. "I'm gonna need you to speak with Mr. Blackwood. There seems to be some confusion about the property lines." "Confusion?" Sarah's laugh came out sharp and bitter. "You destroyed my grandmother's garden based on confusion." Before the foreman could respond, a sleek black Mercedes pulled into the Blackwood driveway. Richard Blackwood emerged, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 62, he carried himself with the casual arrogance of old money and political connections. His wife Victoria followed, her designer yoga attire probably costing more than Sarah's monthly mortgage payment. Richard's eyes swept over the excavation site with the satisfaction of a man surveying his domain. When his gaze landed on Sarah, his expression shifted to one of mild annoyance, as if she were an unexpected insect at a garden party. "Ah, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a career politician. "I see you've met our construction crew." "Your construction crew is on my property, Mr. Blackwood." "Well, that's where you're mistaken, my dear." Richard pulled out his phone and showed her a screen filled with official-looking documents. "According to our recent survey, the property line extends 12 feet further east than previously recorded. What you consider your backyard actually belongs to us. Has for decades, apparently." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. My grandmother owned this land for 50 years. I have the deed. Deeds can be imprecise." Victoria interjected, her voice honey-sweet with an underlying edge of steel. "Property lines shift. Records get updated. These things happen. Marcus stepped forward, his medical training lending authority to his measured tone. Even if that were true, you can't just start construction without proper notification. There are legal procedures, all of which have been followed to the letter, Richard said smoothly. The permits were filed appropriately. Notice was given to all affected parties. I never received any notice, Sarah protested. Victoria's smile was razor-thin. Perhaps you should check your mail more carefully. The excavator roared back to life, drowning out Sarah's response. The operator, apparently having received his orders, began digging deeper into the earth that had been her sanctuary. Each scoop of the mechanical claw felt like a violation, a theft not just of land but of memory itself. Stop. Sarah ran toward the machine, but Marcus caught her arm. Sarah, don't. That's dangerous. This is insane, she said, tears blurring her vision. They can't do this. This is where I scattered Nai's ashes. This is sacred ground. Richard's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, annoyance, maybe, or calculation. I understand your emotional attachment, Sarah. But sentiment doesn't supersede legal ownership. Perhaps we can discuss some sort of a compensation for your inconvenience. Compensation? Sarah's voice cracked. You think money can replace my grandmother's memory garden? Everything has a price, Victoria said quietly, her words nearly lost beneath the mechanical thunder. The excavator hit something solid with a metallic clang that resonated across the yard. The operator shut down the engine and climbed out, calling to the foreman. Sarah watched in horror as they examined what looked like a large, rusted metal container partially unearthed by the digging. Probably just an old septic tank, the foreman said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Richard Blackwood went very still. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat, her face draining of color. Actually, Richard said. His politician's smile never wavering, I think we should call it a day. Let's have the crew clean up and reassess tomorrow. But sir, we are on a tight schedule tomorrow, Richard repeated, his tone brooking no argument. As the construction crew began packing up their equipment, Sarah noticed Victoria whispering urgently into her phone, her back turned to the group. The words were too quiet to make out, but the tension in her posture was unmistakable. Marcus helped Sarah to her porch, where she collapsed onto the steps that had been her throne as a child, her kingdom as a teenager, her refuge as an adult. Everything felt unstable now, as if the very ground beneath her feet could no longer be trusted. We'll fight this, Marcus said firmly. There are lawyers who specialize in property disputes. We'll get records, real surveys, independent assessments, with what money? Sarah laughed bitterly. Look at them, Marcus. Look at this house. She gestured to the Blackwood mansion. They probably spend more on lawn care than I make in a year. How do I fight people like that? As if summoned by her words, Richard appeared at her garden gate, his expression carefully neutral. Sarah, might I have a word? Marcus started to object, but Sarah waved him off. She walked to the gate, noting how Richard positioned himself to block her view of the excavation site. I want you to know that Victoria and I bear no ill will toward you or your family, he began. Your grandmother was a lovely woman. We were sorry to see her go. Then why are you doing this? Richard's pause was almost imperceptible. Business, my dear. The pool will increase property values for the entire neighborhood. Surely you can see the benefit in that. Not if I don't have any property left to benefit from. Which brings me to my proposition. Richard reached into his jacket and withdrew a check already made out in her name. Sarah's eyes widened at the number, more money than she'd ever seen. At one time, enough to pay off her mortgage and have plenty left over. What's the catch? No catch. Simply sign a quitclaim deed acknowledging our ownership of the disputed land, and this is yours. You could travel, go back to school, start that photography business you always talked about. Your grandmother would want you to be free, wouldn't she? The check felt heavy in her hands, weighted with possibility and temptation. She thought of her job at the insurance office, the stack of medical bills from her grandmother's final months, the roof that needed repair and the furnace that wheezed through every winter. But she also thought of the ashes scattered in soil that was being carted away in dump trucks, of the roses that would never bloom again, of the betrayal her grandmother would feel knowing Sarah had sold their sanctuary for money. She handed the check back to Richard. No deal. His smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. I was hoping you'd be reasonable about this, Sarah. Legal battles can be unpleasant, expensive, time-consuming. Are you prepared for that kind of fight? I guess we'll find out. Richard pocketed the check, his politician's mask slipping enough to reveal something. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old Victorian's bones, every whisper of wind through the oak trees, sent her pulse racing. She'd positioned herself at the kitchen window with a thermos of coffee and her grandmother's antique binoculars, watching for any movement in the excavation site. At 3:17 a.m., her vigil paid off. A white van with no markings pulled quietly into the Blackwood driveway. Two men emerged, not the construction crew from earlier, but strangers in dark coveralls who moved with military precision. They worked by the light of red-filtered flashlights, carefully filling in sections of the hole with what looked like concrete mix. Sarah grabbed her phone and started recording, but the distance and darkness made the footage nearly useless. Still, she captured enough to prove something clandestine was happening. When the men finished, they spent another hour smoothing the surface and scattering loose dirt to make it appear untouched. By dawn, it looked as if the mysterious container had never existed. You look like hell, Marcus said when he arrived at her door with coffee and bagels from their favorite cafe downtown. Dark circles shadowed his brown eyes. Apparently, he hadn't slept much either. They came back, Sarah said, showing him the blurry phone footage. Look at this. They're covering something up, Marcus. Something big enough to kill four. Marcus studied the video, his medical mind processing the implications. We need to call the police. And tell them what? That my rich neighbors are building a pool on my land and I think they buried something? You know how that sounds. It sounds like a crime in progress. Sarah sank onto her couch, suddenly exhausted. The Blackwoods have connections everywhere. Richard was deputy mayor for 8 years. Victoria sits on half the charity boards in the city. Who's going to believe me over them? Marcus sat beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. What? About that property dispute? Even if there's something bigger going on, you still have legitimate grounds to challenge their claim. Sarah had been thinking about that all night. I need to see the original deed. The one my great-grandfather got when he bought this place in 1923. Nai kept all the family documents in her safe. The safe was hidden behind a false panel in the basement, installed by Sarah's paranoid great-grandfather during the McCarthy era. Inside, among birth certificates and immigration papers, Sarah found the original property deed. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the yellow document. Marcus, she whispered, look at this. The deed was crystal clear. The property line extended not just to the fence that separated her yard from the Blackwoods, but 12 feet beyond it, meaning a significant portion of the Blackwood mansion was actually built on Chen family land. Holy shit, Marcus breathed. They don't just owe you an apology. They owe you about $2 million in property value. This doesn't make sense, Sarah said, studying the document. If this is accurate, why hasn't anyone noticed before? Property taxes, insurance, mortgage documents. Something should have flagged this decades ago. Before Marcus could answer, Sarah's doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw Detective Ray Castellanos, a thick-set man in his 50s with kind eyes and a rumpled suit that had seen better days. Ms. Chen. I'm Detective Castellanos, Metro PD. I was hoping we could talk about the construction activities in your neighborhood. Sarah's pulse quickened. Has someone filed a complaint? In a manner of speaking. Castellanos stepped inside, his gaze taking in the modest but well-maintained interior. We received an anonymous tip about possible illegal excavation activities. Something about disturbing a potential crime scene. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances. Crime scene. Sarah asked, well, that's what I'm trying to determine. Castellanos pulled out a small notebook. According to our caller, there might be human remains on the property. Now, I know how these neighborhood disputes can get heated, but I have to follow up on any report involving potential homicide. Sarah's blood ran cold. Homicide. The tip was pretty specific. Mentioned a metal container, recent excavation, and possible cover-up activities. Castellanos studied Sarah's face carefully. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? For a split second, Sarah considered lying. But something in the detective's eyes, a weariness that spoke of too many cases where the truth came too late, made her decide to trust him. I recorded something last night, she said, showing him the phone footage. People working in the dark, filling in sections of the excavation. And earlier, they found some kind of metal container but suddenly decided to stop work for the day. Castellanos watched the video twice, his expression growing more serious. Ms. Chen, I need you to understand something. If there's evidence of a crime on that property, this situation just became much more complicated than a simple boundary dispute. What do you mean? I mean that land might not be available for construction for a very long time. Potentially. Years, depending on what we find. A sharp knock interrupted them. Through the window, Sarah saw Victoria Blackwood on her porch, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Sarah's car. Her smile was bright and predatory. Sarah, darling, Victoria said when the door opened, her gaze sliding over Detective Castellanos with practiced assessment. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Richard and I wanted to discuss a revised offer for the property settlement. This isn't a good time, Mrs. Blackwood, Sarah said. Oh, but I think it's a perfect time. Victoria stepped inside without invitation, her designer heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Detective, isn't it? I don't believe we've met. Victoria Blackwood. She extended her hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. Detective Castellanos, Metro PD. How wonderful that our tax dollars are being put to good use, Victoria said, her tone suggesting the opposite. I hope Sarah hasn't been wasting your time with frivolous complaints about legitimate construction activities. Nothing frivolous. About potential evidence tampering, Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment. Evidence? How dramatic. I assure you, Detective, everything we are doing is completely above board. Permitted, licensed, and supervised by the finest contractors. In the city. Then you won't mind if we take a closer look at the excavation site. Actually, Victoria said, reaching into her purse and withdrawing an official-looking document, I'm afraid that won't be possible. We've obtained a temporary restraining order preventing any interference with our construction project. Seems someone has been making baseless accusations that could cost us significant money in delays. Sarah stared at the legal document, her heart sinking. The order was dated that morning. They'd moved with impossible speed to get ahead of any investigation. Detective Castellanos examined the restraining order, his jaw tightening. This prevents Ms. Chen from interfering with construction. It doesn't prevent a police investigation. Doesn't it? Victoria's smile returned, sharp as a blade. I think you'll find that our attorney has been quite thorough. The construction site is private property, properly secured, and any investigation would require a warrant based on probable cause. Anonymous tips and blurry cell phone videos hardly constitute probable cause, do they? Sarah watched the legal chess match unfold, feeling increasingly helpless. Victoria Blackwood wasn't just wealthy, she was smart, prepared, and clearly had experience navigating the legal system. However, Victoria continued, Richard and I remain committed to being good neighbors. Sarah, we are prepared to increase our offer substantially. She placed a new check on the coffee table, this one, for twice the amount Richard had offered the day before. All you have to do is sign the quitclaim deed and stop making these unfortunate accusations. You could be on a beach in Thailand by next month, far away from all this unpleasantness. Sarah looked at the check, then at the original property. Deeds still lying on her couch. An idea began to form, dangerous, but potentially brilliant. Mrs. Blackwood, Sarah said slowly, before I consider your offer, I'd like to clarify something about the property lines. What about them? Sarah picked up the original deed, her hand surprisingly steady. According to this document, which I found in my grandmother's papers, the boundary between our properties isn't where you think it is. Victoria's eyes sharpened. I'm sure our surveyors, according to this, your house, specifically, your master bedroom, your library, and about half of your kitchen are built on land that belongs to my family. Has belonged to us since 1923. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's composure cracked, revealing something ugly underneath. That's impossible, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Detective Castellanos stepped forward. Mind if I take a look at that deed? Victoria moved quickly, reaching for the document, but Marcus intercepted her. I don't think so, Mrs. Blackwood. You have no idea what you're messing with, Victoria snarled, her mask finally slipping completely. Some secrets are worth killing for, and some people aren't smart enough to leave well enough alone. Is that a threat? Detective Castellanos asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. Victoria realized her mistake immediately. Her politician's smile snapped back into place, but the damage was done. Of course not, Detective. Simply a turn of phrase. I'm sure Sarah understands that legal battles can be emotionally devastating. But Sarah. Detective Castellanos had the warrant within 4 hours, a testament to both the urgency of the situation and the judge's willingness to approve searches involving potential homicide. By afternoon, Sarah's quiet neighborhood had transformed into a crime scene, complete with yellow tape, forensics teams, and news vans that seemed to multiply by the hour. Sarah watched from her living room window as investigators in white coveralls methodically excavated the site where the Blackwoods had planned their infinity pool. The metal container that had briefly appeared yesterday was gone, but the soil told its own story. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed multiple anomalies, buried throughout the area. Preliminary findings suggest human remains, Detective Castellanos told her, his voice grim. Multiple individuals, based on what the forensics team can determine. We are talking about a significant crime scene that's been undisturbed for decades. Marcus gripped Sarah's hand as they absorbed the implications. How long have they been there? That's what we are trying to determine. Could be anywhere from 20 to 50 years, based on the soil composition and decay patterns. We've called in a forensic anthropologist from the State University. Through the window, Sarah watched Richard and Victoria Blackwood standing on their front porch, their faces masks of careful concern. Richard was speaking into his phone with the animated gestures of someone accustomed to making problems disappear through the right connections. Victoria kept checking her watch, her posture, radiating barely contained panic. There's something else, Castellanos continued. The anonymous tip that brought me here. It came from inside the Blackwood house. Someone called from their landline at 2:47 a.m. Sarah's eyes widened. Someone in their own family turned them in. That's what it looks like. The caller was female, spoke in whispers, and specifically mentioned the metal container and recent cover-up activities. She knew details that weren't visible from the street. A commotion outside drew their attention. A black sedan with government plates had pulled up, and 2 people in expensive suits were striding toward the crime scene. The lead investigator, a woman with steel-grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, flashed credentials that made the uniformed officers step back immediately. FBI, Castellanos muttered. This just got federal. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text. From an unknown number. Meet me at Riverside Park. East Pavilion. Come alone. I have information about what's buried in your yard. A friend, she showed the message to Marcus and Detective Castellanos. The detective frowned. Could be dangerous. If someone in that house is feeding us information, they might also be in danger themselves. Or it could be a trap, Marcus said. But Sarah was already reaching for her jacket. It's the only lead we have. And if someone risked calling in that tip, they deserve a chance to tell their story. Riverside Park was a 10-minute drive from Maple Grove Drive, its sprawling grounds dotted with families enjoying the afternoon sunshine. The East Pavilion sat overlooking the river, partially hidden by a grove of willows that provided natural cover from prying eyes. Sarah arrived first, her nerves on edge as she scanned the area for potential threats. The pavilion appeared empty except for an elderly woman sitting alone on a bench, feeding breadcrumbs to a cluster of ducks. As Sarah approached, the woman looked up, revealing features that were aristocratic despite her simple clothing. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent blue eyes that held depths of sadness. You're Sarah Chen, the woman said. It wasn't a question. And you are Margaret Blackwood, Richard's mother. Sarah's breath caught. She'd heard references to Richard's mother over the years but had assumed the woman was dead or living elsewhere. Margaret looked frail but alert, her hand steady as she continued feeding the ducks. "You called the police," Sarah said. Margaret nodded slowly. 53 years too late, but yes. I called them. "What's buried in my yard, Mrs. Blackwood?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the ducks paddle in the gentle current. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. His name was James Morrison. He was 24 years old, a journalism student at the university. Smart boy. Too smart for his own good. She turned to face Sarah, tears glistening in her eyes. He was also Victoria's first husband. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. Victoria was married before. Oh yes. Long before she met my son. James was investigating a series of suspicious deaths at the chemical plant where Richard's father worked. Industrial accidents, they called them. Workers who'd gotten too vocal about safety violations, environmental concerns. James had evidence, documents, photographs, witness statements. He was going to expose everything. Margaret's hand shook as she reached into her purse and withdrew a manila envelope. I kept copies. Hidden them all these years, waiting for the right moment. Or maybe just waiting for the courage. Inside the envelope were photocopied documents, newspaper clippings, and black and white photographs. Sarah recognized a younger version of Victoria in several images, her arm linked with a handsome young man who radiated idealistic determination. Richard's father offered James money to drop his investigation, Margaret continued. When that didn't work, they tried threats. James was stubborn. He believed in justice, in holding powerful people accountable. Victoria begged him to let it go, to think about their future together. But James couldn't be bought or scared off. So they killed him. Richard's father and 2 men from the plant. They made it look like James had left town suddenly, packed his things, closed his bank account, even sent Victoria a note saying he'd found someone else. She believed it for years. Everyone did. Margaret's voice broke. I found out the truth by accident, 10 years later. I was helping Richard's father clean out some old files from his study, and I found photographs. Pictures of James's body, wrapped in canvas, being lowered into a hole in what's now your backyard. There were others too, at least 3 more men, who'd gotten too close to the truth. Sarah stared at the photographs, her hands trembling. The images were grainy but unmistakable, a freshly dug grave, wrapped bodies, faces she didn't recognize but whose deaths had clearly been methodically planned. Why didn't you come forward then? Margaret's laugh was bitter. With what? My word against my dead husband's? Richard was already in politics, already making connections. And Victoria. Victoria never knew. She remarried my son believing her first husband had abandoned her. How do you tell someone that their new family built their fortune on murder? But she knows now. She suspected for years. Little things. Richard's father's deathbed confessions when he was medicated and rambling. Documents she wasn't supposed to see. Last week, when they decided to build that pool, she confronted Richard about choosing that exact spot. He told her enough of the truth to terrify her. Sarah looked up from the photographs. If Victoria knows, why is she going along with this? Margaret's expression hardened. Because my son threatened to implicate her in the cover-up. Told her that her fingerprints were on some of the original documents, that she'd helped dispose of James's personal belongings. It's not true, she was an innocent victim, but Richard has convinced her that no one would believe her. That she'd go to prison along with him. And you've stayed silent all this time. I tried to leave. Richard cut off my finances, had me declared mentally incompetent when I threatened to go to the police. I've been essentially a prisoner in that house. For 15 years. Margaret's eyes flashed with long-suppressed anger. But when I saw them breaking ground in your grandmother's garden, desecrating the place where you scattered her ashes to hide their crimes, I couldn't be silent anymore. Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The property dispute. They're not just trying to steal my land, they're trying to make sure they control the crime scene forever. Exactly. As long as the pool is built and the evidence is sealed under 20 tons of concrete, their secret stays buried. But if you fight them, if you bring in surveyors and lawyers and investigators, the truth comes out. Margaret nodded. Richard knows that if this becomes a protracted legal battle, someone will eventually order a thorough examination of the property, ground-penetrating radar, soil samples, all the things that are happening right now. Sarah's phone buzzed with a call from Detective Castellanos. "Ms. Chen, you need to get back here. We've found something significant." When Sarah returned to Maple Grove Drive, the crime scene had expanded to cover both her backyard and a significant portion of the Blackwood property. FBI agents were interviewing neighbors while forensics teams worked with methodical precision. Detective Castellanos met her at the police line. "We've recovered remains from 4 individuals, all showing signs of blunt force trauma. Based on personal effects found with the bodies, one of them is James Morrison, reported missing in 1971. Sarah looked toward the Blackwood house, where Victoria stood at an upstairs window, her silhouette framed against expensive curtains. As Sarah watched, Victoria pressed her hand against the glass in what might have been despair or surrender. "There's more," Castellanos continued. "We executed search warrants on the house and found a safe containing documents, photographs, and what appears to be a detailed confession written by Richard B. 3 weeks after the arrests, Sarah stood in her grandmother's garden, or what remained of it, watching forensics teams complete their final excavation. The crime scene tape was gone, replaced by the careful markers that indicated where 4 men had been laid to rest in unmarked graves. The earth looked violated, scarred, but somehow cleaner than it had in decades. Ms. Chen." Dr. Elena Vasquez, the forensic anthropologist from the State University, approached with a manila folder tucked under her arm. Her weathered face bore the gravity of someone who spent her days giving voices to the voiceless dead. "I wanted to share our final findings with you personally." Sarah braced herself for more revelations. The past 3 weeks had brought a parade of investigators, lawyers, and reporters, each peeling back another layer of the Blackwood family's carefully constructed facade. "We've identified all 4 victims," Dr. Vasquez continued. "James Morrison, as we suspected; Thomas Riley, a safety inspector at the chemical plant; Michael Santos, an environmental lawyer who was building a case against Blackwood Industries; and David Kim, a union organizer who was pushing for better working conditions." Each name hit Sarah like a physical blow. These weren't just statistics, they were sons, husbands, fathers whose families had spent decades wondering what happened to them. "The good news," Dr. Vasquez said gently, "is that we can finally give them proper burials, and their families will have answers." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. The weight of being the accidental guardian of this truth felt enormous. Marcus emerged from her house carrying 2 cups of coffee, his medical residency temporarily on hold, while he helped Sarah navigate the legal maze that had consumed her life. "The FBI agent is here," he said quietly. "Agent Morrison. She wants to talk to you about the federal charges." Agent Lisa Morrison was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to pursuing the powerful. Sarah had learned that Agent Morrison's interest in the case was more than professional. James Morrison had been her uncle, the brother her father never stopped looking for. "Sarah," Agent Morrison said, settling into the living room that had become an unofficial headquarters for the investigation. "I wanted to update you on where things stand legally." She opened a thick file that seemed to contain the entire sordid history of Blackwood Industries. Richard Blackwood Jr. has been charged with obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and accessory after the fact to multiple homicides. His father's posthumous confession, combined with the physical evidence, and Victoria's testimony, makes the case airtight. "What about Victoria?" Agent Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Victoria's cooperation has been invaluable. She's provided documentation, testified before the grand jury, and helped us understand the full scope of the cover-up. In exchange for her continued cooperation, the prosecutor has agreed to recommend reduced charges, likely obstruction and evidence tampering, with the possibility of suspended sentence given her status as a victim herself." Sarah felt a complicated mix of relief and sadness. Victoria Blackwood was many things, but she wasn't a killer. She was a woman who'd been manipulated by grief into participating in something unspeakable. "There's something else," Agent Morrison continued. "The investigation has uncovered a pattern of similar incidents at Blackwood Industries facilities across 3 states. We are looking at potentially dozens of victims over a 20-year period. This case has opened the door to prosecutions that families thought would never come." The scope of it was staggering. What had started as a property dispute over a swimming pool had revealed decades of systematic murder and cover-up. And Margaret Blackwood. Protective custody for now, until Richard's trial is over. Her testimony will be crucial, and there are concerns about potential retaliation from business associates who might want to keep this quiet. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah opened it to find a young woman in her 30s with dark hair and James Morrison's intelligent eyes. Behind her stood an elderly couple who moved with the careful dignity of people carrying long grief. "Ms. Chen," the young woman said. "I'm Jennifer Morrison Hayes. James was my father." Sarah's throat tightened. "Please, come in." Jennifer was followed by Thomas Riley's widow and adult children, Michael Santos's brother, and David Kim's elderly parents. One by one, the families of the murdered men gathered in Sarah's living room, an informal wake for men who died fighting for justice and had been denied even the dignity of proper burial. "We wanted to thank you," Jennifer said, her voice steady, despite the tears in her eyes. "For 53 years, we didn't know what happened to my father. My mother died believing he'd abandoned us. At least now we know he died trying to do the right thing." Mrs. Riley, a woman in her 70s with steel-grey hair and calloused hands, spoke up. "My Tommy always said the truth had a way of coming out eventually. Took longer than any of us hoped, but here we are." David Kim's father, bent with age but sharp-eyed, addressed Sarah in heavily accented English. "You could have taken their money. Many people would have. But you chose to fight. My son would have respected that choice." Sarah looked around the room at these families who'd been denied closure for decades, and felt the full weight of what her stubborn refusal to sell her grandmother's garden had unleashed. "I just wanted to protect my grandmother's memory," she said. "I never imagined it would lead to this." "Sometimes," Jennifer said quietly, "the most important battles are the ones we never planned to fight." Agent Morrison cleared her throat. "There's one more thing we need to discuss. The property settlement." Sarah had almost forgotten about the original dispute that started everything, with Richard facing federal charges and Victoria cooperating. With prosecutors, the legal status of the land had become secondary to the criminal proceedings. "Based on the original deed you found, your family owns not just the disputed area but a significant portion of what's currently the Blackwood property. The house, the gardens, probably close to 3 acres total." Marcus whistled low. "That's worth millions." "The Blackwood estate will likely be liquidated to pay legal fees and potential civil judgments from the victims' families," Agent Morrison continued. "But your claim predates all of that. You could end up owning one of the most valuable properties in the city." Sarah looked out the window at the excavated yard, at the markers indicating where 4 good men had been murdered for trying to protect others. The thought of profiting from their deaths felt obscene. "What if I don't want it?" Agent Morrison raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about walking away from millions of dollars." "I'm talking about doing the right thing." Sarah turned to face the families gathered in her living room. This land belongs to their memory now. What would honor them most? Jennifer Morrison Hayes spoke first. "A memorial. Something that tells their story, reminds people that fighting for justice sometimes costs everything." Mrs. Riley nodded. "Tommy would like that. He always said workers deserve to be remembered." David Kim's father smiled for the first time since arriving. "My son believed in education. Maybe something that teaches young people to ask difficult questions." Over the following hour, they sketched out a vision, a memorial park on the site, where the men had been buried, with an adjoining education center focused on workers' rights, environmental protection, and investigative journalism. Sarah would deed the property to a foundation managed by the families, ensuring it would serve the causes the men had died defending. "It's beautiful," Agent Morrison said when they'd finished planning. "But Sarah, you're giving up generational wealth. Are you sure about this?" Sarah thought of her grandmother, who'd fled poverty in China to build a life based on dignity and hard work. She thought of James Morrison and the others, who'd chosen principle over safety and paid the ultimate price. "My grandmother always said that wealth isn't what you accumulate, it's what you leave behind that matters. I can't think of a better legacy than making sure these men are never forgotten." As the families prepared to leave, Jennifer Morrison Hayes pulled Sarah aside. "There's something I want you to have." She handed Sarah a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside was a simple gold wedding band and a faded photograph of James and Victoria on their wedding day. They looked impossibly young, radiant with hope and possibility. This was in my father's personal effects when they found him. I think Victoria should have the ring back. She loved him enough to ultimately choose justice over self-preservation. But I thought you might like to keep the photograph. A reminder that love and truth can survive even the darkest attempts to bury them. That evening, Sarah sat on her grandmother's porch with Marcus, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The excavated yard looked raw and wounded, but she could envision the memorial that would grow there, a place where people would come to remember that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. No regrets. Marcus asked, his arm around her shoulders. Sarah thought about the check Victoria had offered, about the mansion she could have owned, about the quiet life she'd lost forever. Then she thought about James Morrison's parents, who'd died without knowing what happened to their son. About Thomas Riley's family, who'd blamed themselves. 2 years later, Sarah stood at the podium in the James Morrison Memorial Center, looking out at an audience that included investigative journalists, labor organizers, environmental lawyers, and families of workers who died fighting for justice across the country. The annual Morrison Memorial Lecture had become one of the most prestigious events in advocacy journalism, drawing speakers and attendees from around the world. Behind her, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the memorial garden where 4 granite markers stood among carefully tended roses and native wildflowers. The inscription on each stone was simple but powerful: he died so others might live safely. Visitors came daily to walk the paths, read the educational displays, and reflect on the price of justice. 2 years ago, Sarah began, I thought I was fighting to save my grandmother's rose garden. I had no idea I was fighting to give voice to men who'd been silenced for half a century. In the front row, Jennifer Morrison Hayes smiled through tears. Beside her sat Victoria Blackwood, now Victoria Morrison again, having legally reclaimed her first husband's name after her divorce was finalized. The 18 months of probation and community service had transformed her from a politician's polished wife into something more authentic, a woman dedicated to honoring the memory of her first love. Victoria's testimony had been instrumental in securing convictions not just against Richard, but against a network of corrupt officials and business leaders who'd participated in the systematic silencing of whistleblowers. Richard himself was serving 25 to life in federal prison, his political connections proving worthless once the scope of his family's crimes became public. The Morrison Center has already supported 17 major investigations into corporate malfeasance, Sarah continued, reading from her prepared remarks. We've provided legal assistance to 43 families seeking justice for workplace deaths. We've trained over 200 young journalists in investigative techniques. But perhaps most importantly, we've created a place where truth tellers know they are not alone. The audience erupted in applause. Sarah caught Marcus's eye in the third row. Dr. Marcus Delacroix, now having completed his residency and returned to work at the free clinic that served the city's most vulnerable populations. His presence grounded her, a reminder of the life they'd built together. In the aftermath of chaos, after the ceremony, Sarah walked through the memorial garden as evening shadows stretched across the perfectly maintained grounds. The space bore no resemblance to the crime scene it had once been. Instead, it felt sacred, a place where the past and present converged in service of justice. Sarah. A familiar voice called from the main path. Margaret Blackwood approached slowly, her walker clicking against the stone pathway. At 73, she'd found a new purpose in her final years, becoming a fierce advocate for elder abuse prevention and a vocal supporter of the Memorial Center. Margaret, Sarah smiled, offering her arm for support. How are you feeling? Strong. Enough to see Richard's appeals denied, which happened this morning. Margaret's eyes sparkled with satisfaction. The bastard will die in prison, which is more mercy than he showed those 4 men. They walked together toward James Morrison's marker, where fresh flowers, roses from Victoria's own garden, had been placed that morning. I wanted to thank you again, Margaret said quietly, for giving me the chance to do the right thing before it was too late. For 50 years, I was a coward. But you showed me that it's never too late to choose justice over comfort. Sarah squeezed the older woman's hand. You found the courage when it mattered most. As they stood in comfortable silence, Victoria approached from the parking area, her arms full of documents and a determined expression on her face. "Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt," Victoria said, "but I have news. The FBI task force just arrested 12 more people in connection with the Blackwood Industries conspiracy. Companies in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. The investigation you started has taken down an entire network." The scope still amazed Sarah. What had begun with a property dispute over a swimming pool had revealed a systematic pattern of murder spanning decades and multiple states. The Morrison Center's research team had helped connect dots that law enforcement agencies had been unable to see individually. "There's something else," Victoria continued, her voice trembling with excitement. "They found him. They found Robert Chen." Sarah's world stopped. "What? Your great-uncle? The one who disappeared in 1952. There was a file in one of the Ohio facilities. Apparently he'd been asking questions about working conditions at a plant there. They found his remains last week in an unmarked grave on company property." Sarah sank onto a nearby bench, overwhelmed. Her family had always wondered what happened to Robert Chen, her grandfather's younger brother who'd vanished while working his way west from San Francisco. He'd been brilliant, idealistic, passionate about workers' rights. Now she knew he'd died the same way as James Morrison and the others, silenced for trying to protect people. "He was family," Margaret said softly, understanding immediately. "The circle is complete." The following month brought the strangest phone call of Sarah's life. "Miss Chen. This is Patricia Hoffman from the MacArthur Foundation. I'm calling to inform you that you've been selected as this year's recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship for your work in investigative justice and memorial preservation." Sarah had to ask her to repeat herself twice. The MacArthur Genius Grant, $625,000 over 5 years, no strings attached, was given to individuals who showed exceptional creativity and potential for future contribution. "I'm not sure I understand," Sarah said. "I'm not a journalist or an academic. I just refused to sell my grandmother's garden." "Miss Chen," Patricia replied, "you've created a new model for grassroots justice advocacy. The Morrison Center has become a template that communities around the world are adopting. You've shown that ordinary people can hold powerful institutions accountable when they are willing to fight for what's right. The money would ensure the Morrison Center's future, allowing them to expand their investigative training programs and provide even more support to families seeking justice." But for Sarah, the real victory was simpler. She'd kept her promise to her grandmother. That evening, she and Marcus sat in the garden behind their house, the original Victorian that now served as the Morrison Center's headquarters. The excavated crime scene had been transformed into a reflection pool surrounded by memorial plaques bearing the names of workers who died defending others' rights. Robert Chen's name had been added just that morning. "No regrets?" Marcus asked, echoing the question he'd posed 2 years earlier. Sarah looked at the memorial, then at the center where lights still burned as researchers worked late into the night. Then at the man who'd stood by her through everything. They'd married 6 months ago in a simple ceremony in the memorial garden, with Jennifer Morrison Hayes as maid of honor and Margaret Blackwood officiating as a recently ordained minister. "I used to think my biggest decision was whether to take that insurance job after college," Sarah said. "Turns out my biggest decision was whether to trust that my grandmother knew what she was doing when she scattered her ashes in soil that held so many secrets. And she did. She always said that justice delayed isn't justice denied, it's justice gathering strength." Sarah smiled, remembering her grandmother's voice, her wisdom, her unshakable belief that truth would always find a way to surface. In the distance, they could hear the sound of construction. The city was building affordable housing on the lot where the Blackwood mansion had stood, ensuring that the site would serve working families rather than the wealthy elite who'd built their fortune on murder. Victoria Morrison, who'd used her share of the liquidated Blackwood assets to fund victim compensation, had moved into a modest apartment near the Memorial Center, where she worked as a volunteer coordinator and advocate for victims' families. She'd found peace in service, redemption in truth-telling. Margaret Blackwood lived in a senior community near the memorial, where she spent her days writing a book about standing up to family corruption. At 73, she'd become an unlikely hero to advocates for elder rights and institutional accountability, and Richard Blackwood rotted in federal prison, his appeals exhausted, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the inevitable price of prioritizing power over human life. Sarah stood and walked to her grandmother's memorial stone, placed at the edge of the reflection pool where Nai's ashes had first been scattered. The inscription, in both English and Chinese, read, "She planted seeds of justice in soil that seemed barren. From her garden grew truth that could not be buried." "I kept the promise, Nai," Sarah whispered. "I protected what you loved, and it protected so much more than either of us ever imagined." As if in response, a gentle breeze stirred the roses that now bloomed throughout the memorial garden, descendants of the plants that had been destroyed to hide murder, now flourishing in service of memory and justice. The truth, Sarah reflected, really did have a way of growing in the most unexpected places. Sometimes it just needed someone stubborn enough to refuse to let it be buried, even when the entire world seemed aligned against her. Behind her, the Morrison Memorial Center buzzed with activity as another generation of truth seekers prepared to carry on the woe.